Welcome to Climate Change and Social Change. I'm Wilson Dickinson. This is the first presentation, Rethinking the Sources or the What. So this series of presentations, I'm hoping to provide some rather sweeping sketches to help Christian communities that are concerned about climate change to think about their efforts in more systemic and transformative terms. I'm also hoping to lay out some frameworks that will help people working for climate justice, for food justice, and social justice to see how the efforts of these communities can fit together, both in the present and on longer timelines. At the heart of this work is a shift in strategies and assumptions that have guided mainstream environmentalism and American liberalism for the last several decades. And in this presentation, I'm going to spend a bit of time laying out this shift. Specifically, I want to examine how we understand the sources of the problem. Now, before I get into some of the details, I want to offer a thumbnail sketch of these different approaches. For the mainstream approach, it's imagined that the primary problem that needs to be addressed is denial of climate change itself. So on this account, it's the ignorant conservative other that needs to be enlightened of the facts. And so what we really need is for people to listen to the science. I find this approach is lacking for a multitude of reasons. Most obvious among them is that this strategy of presenting charts and graphs about the scientific consensus has been tried for decades, and it has not been particularly effective. Furthermore, missing from this effort is the thought of how will people with an authoritarian view of power and a xenophobic relationship with the world respond if they are indeed convinced of these facts? It could be that the acknowledgement of a global threat by certain elements of our political and economic structures could come with a dystopic set of responses. In fact, with the building of walls and the strengthening of security apparatuses, it already has. But the primary objection that I have to this approach is that it obscures the systemic roots of the problem. There's a powerful form of climate change denial that has played a significant role in American politics and therefore in global politics. But what do we make of the fact that the number of Americans who are concerned about climate change has never slipped below 50% since the question was been asked by Gallup in 1990? A majority of Americans are and have been convinced, but we have still not been able to effectuate change. Now, a good part of this has to do with structures of economic and political power that bypass or control democratic processes. But I think that part of this has to do with the enormous number of people who are in denial about the implications of climate change. How else could we describe the experience of people accepting the reality that climate change is happening and who respond with thinking that what we need to change are a few light bulbs and drive hybrid cars? So many people are in denial about the implications of climate change. Furthermore, the fixation on climate skeptics seems to be prevalent because it fits into deeply ingrained cultural narratives. On this account, problems are solved when the ignorant other is civilized with our enlightened reason. This understanding of the problem externalizes the problem onto another group and allows us to think that there is nothing wrong with the system. It's just that others need to be brought back within its reasonable goodness. So what this denial about the implications of climate change and the fixation on climate skepticism covers up is that this problem is rooted in our systems and that our ways of life have to change. Now, the demands for such change are unavoidably overwhelming, and it's natural for us to avoid and numb out in the face of such a challenge. In these presentations, I want to try to show the way that different forms of immediate and long-term work can fit together to make such change possible. So I hope that these big picture sketches might alleviate some of the fear and free us from apathy so that we can start getting to the very long but also deeply joyful and rewarding work of bringing about systemic and social change. And this work for change is actually very hopeful, as it turns out that the systems that need to change are the ones that are already causing widespread suffering through poverty, oppression, and empty ways of life that are the source of deep anxiety, depression, alienation, loneliness, and conflict. One of our primary challenges, however, is that we have been taught to trust these systems as a source of goodness and security. And so many of our battles will have internal fronts in addition to external struggles. So briefly put, the approach I'm hoping to outline seeks to bring about systemic change. I want to shift focus from a preoccupation with the presentation of facts and changes in consumer behavior and efficiencies in operations. Shift focus from that to efforts of transformative and liberative pedagogy that bring systems of power and injustice into view. But our work is not simply to unveil and resist these systems, but we're called to engage in the communal and embodied work of transforming places, practices, and relationships so that we can live into a beautiful, joyful, and just way of life. Now, from these grassroots efforts, we will build the collective power to bring about system change. Now, in this first presentation, I want to talk about the sources or the what of climate change. In subsequent presentations, I will talk about different roles and relationships that will be needed for social and systemic change, or the who. I fear that we are often frozen in inaction because we feel like we should be doing all of the work on our own and don't see specific parts that we can play in our given context. We'll also talk about the different timelines and timescales that these efforts are working on, or the when, as this change will not happen all at once. And I'll consider how these efforts might begin and how they might work in collaboration. In this presentation, I want to complexify our understanding of the sources of the ecological crisis so as to broaden the avenues for change we perceive and that we can pursue. The lack of understanding or acknowledgement of social power and communal life that is characteristic of mainstream and especially white and classically liberal approaches to environmentalism obscure these possibilities for change. This lack of acknowledgement not only makes environmental issues into a special interest that are kept separate from other issues of justice, but it also radically limits the relevance of church communities and traditions of faith from offering profound modes of transformation. How we approach a problem is typically shaped by how we understand the problem. So in order to get at a number of different approaches to the ecological crisis, I want to heuristically lay out 3 different accounts of the sources of the crisis itself. So for the first approach, which I have called the mainstream approach, but which I'm tempted to abusively label the head buried in the sand approach, there is a general understanding of climate change. It's understood that the primary cause of climate change are different kinds of emissions, carbon and methane emissions, and there is some degree of understanding of the various components that contribute to this. There's an understanding that carbon is emitted into the atmosphere as forests are cut down, which serve as the lungs of the earth, capturing carbon and providing oxygen. As planes, trains, and automobiles burn fuel, as buildings are heated and cooled and electronics power on, as industrial agriculture fertilizes its fields and operates machinery to plant, harvest, and process and ship its food all over the world, as manufacturers churn out their products, and so on, greenhouse gases, carbon and methane, and so on, are emitted. So while in this approach, one might even have a complex understanding of these component and technical aspects of carbon emissions, they have a rather simplistic understanding of the sources and structures that produce and demand these components. Right, so the far right side of the flowchart here. So here, complex cultural, economic, and political formations are simply understood as arising from human need. The source of the problem on this account is often described with facile musings on human nature. Here, the expansion of Western structures of consumerism is understood as an expanding supply to meet an inevitable human demand, because on this account, consumerist and white culture is taken to be synonymous with humanity and progress. Or, the lack of collective action on the problem is explained as the limits of human nature for individuals to look past their own short-term self-interest to think systemically. because on this account there is no sense of how structures of power shape action and desire. So since these economic, political, and cultural structures are taken as given and natural, the focus on this approach is on making technological shifts. Hope is placed on the emergence of green technologies and a green economy. The agents of change for this approach, as you'll see under the main heading, are individual experts and consumers. Now, as Project Drawdown showed a couple of years ago, we currently have the technology that's needed so that we can not only curb the growth of future emissions, but that we already have the technology to even begin to draw down carbon, to lower the levels of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. This project took all the top responses and solutions and did the math to see what would happen if these solutions were applied and maximally scaled up. Now, what we lack then is the political will and cultural capacity to make these shifts. And so, as Drawdown makes clear, many of these changes are low-tech and have much more to do with cultural change. For example, among the top 10 solutions, reducing food waste, eating a plant-rich diet, preserving tropical forests, family planning and educating girls, all outrank anything having to do with solar energy. Or when it comes to the sectors that these solutions come from, food contributes a much larger piece of the pie than energy. And the combination of land use and the education and empowerment of women and girls adds up to more than changes in energy. So in many ways, we already have the technology. We just lack the collective power and the cultural capacity to make these shifts. Furthermore, if we were just to apply the technology available for emissions surrounding energy and efficiency side efforts, we would not be anywhere close to where we need to be. So on the second approach, which I'm calling here the approach of mainstream environmentalism, the sources of the problem are taken to be largely the same. Humans want and need what they want and need, and the solution is a technological transition. Only on this account, there is an acknowledgement that there are significant economic and political obstacles. The economic and political problems are not, however, so much problems of form or structure, not that they're inherent to our political and economic structures, but they are problems of content. On this approach, the economy actually holds the solution, as it will drive innovation and the creation of a new, more efficient and productive green world. The problems, according to mainstream environmentalists, is that the current economy is built on fossil fuel and is controlled by some backward-looking actors who also exercise a great deal of political power. So while the current economy and political structures are seen as at least given, if not natural or even good, the problem on this account is that they cannot be sustained as they have been operating, and so we need to make a little substitution. So given this diagnosis of the problem, the task is to change the fuel that drives the economy and the leadership that runs the corporate world and government. So the agents of change on this approach are not just scientific experts, as you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner, but also the experts who will lead in efforts of lobbying and litigation to change policy and leadership. The captains of industry who have the vision to simply switch the economy over to the magic green stuff. And the consumers, donors, and voters who will support these experts and captains. So while this approach is somewhat attentive to political and economic structures, it largely appeals to and relies upon structures of power that are premised on the destructive elements that are the source of the problem. So while there might be policy advances on this front of efficiency with this approach, without addressing the underlying systemic problems, things only get increasingly worse. So for example, there have been a number of remarkable policy victories to curb the use of plastic. Regulations in China alone have decreased consumption by as many as 40 billion plastic bags a year. Yet business models mean that these efficiencies and savings are taken and reinvested in further growth, in more factories, products, and stores. And so plastic production continues to increase as manufacturers produce 300 million tons a year. So the reality is that our current structures are unsustainable, both in terms of their logic, which is premised on growth, and in terms of the carrying capacity of the Earth. It would take 5 Earths to support everyone living like the average American. 5 Earths, just for the average American. And as you saw with drawdown, alternative energy only addresses less than a quarter of the drawdown needed. We cannot simply switch out fossil fuels and maintain the same system. Just as significant is that on this account, there's not a particularly robust strategy for how change will happen. It seems largely premised on the hope that hearts and minds of the powerful will be changed and that this will trickle down. So for the third approach, which I'm calling the environmental justice approach, the sources of the problems are more complex and structural. And I'll pause for a second since this slide is also rather complex in its structures. So on this account, there is still a sense that part of these issues arise from a basic kind of human need, right? So the complexity in this slide is on the right-hand side in the sources. So there's still the sense of human need, and that the problems also arise from very specific technologies. But there's a deeper understanding of the ways in which these problems also emerge from specific, if complex and diverse, structures of power. And that these vast systems and structures are rooted in and incarnated by particular ways of life, of community, habitats, and locales. So on this account, the economy is not a network where natural supply meets natural demand. But there is an acknowledgement that there are structures that push, pull, and manipulate both supply and demand. Political structures on this account are not taken as neutral or natural. The current inability to enact cultural change is not so much traced back to the decisions of individuals, which are driven by an ahistorical human nature. Rather, this lack of collective action is seen as the result of specific histories, of the political, economic, and cultural movement of neoliberalism that has actively dismantled prior forms of collective action that exist outside of the logic of corporations, like unions, neighborhoods, churches, governments, etc. And these neoliberal formations are seen as the inheritors of centuries of imperialism and colonialism. And so the antagonisms between groups it's not understood with an ahistorical term like tribalism, but through specific formations of racism, class struggle, etc. Furthermore, people are not seen as individuals who exist outside of context, but they are seen as members of communities and particular kinds of geographies. The carbon emissions from heating and cooling buildings does not occur in a uniform metric whereby each person is thought to contribute and need the same amount of energy. But this form of emissions is determined by the kind of houses we live in our contexts, or the places that we work. So living in a single-family home in a suburb, for example, is not natural, but it is a habitat shaped by political and economic pressures and moral visions of what a good life is supposed to look like. So on the environmental justice account, then, the problem is not seen as simply a technological issue in need of technological answers, or of the replacement of the content of a carbon economy with a green economy, but the problem is taken to be with specific technologies and specific economic and political structures and the way that power flows through them. Furthermore, these structures are instantiated in and supported by certain moral traditions and brick, mortar, concrete, and asphalt architectures. So given this broad understanding of the problem, the environmental justice approach has a broader vision for what, why, how, where, and through whom change can happen. So, bottom left-hand corner, on this account, individuals are not left to vote and consume differently so as to simply empower another set of experts. But communities are called to unveil the violence of dominant moral traditions, to live into other traditions, and to transform the social infrastructure and ways in our ways of life that surround them so as to live into a better life, and to build grassroots power that can change unjust political and economic structures. So to say a bit more about how this different set of responses looks, I want to look a little more closely at the component cause of agriculture from this perspective, because modern food movements and the work of food justice are already opening the types of avenues for local collective change. But to see these types of change, we first have to understand the degree to which our agricultural system is not a naturally occurring response to human need. There is, admittedly, a daily and unavoidable sense in which people need to cultivate food. But the way our current system is set up is not the only or even most efficient way to feed humanity. Industrial agriculture demands a tremendous amount of fossil fuels to function, demanding somewhere between 8 and 6 calories of fuel to produce 1 calorie of food. So whereas sustainable farming practices can produce 12 calories of food for 1 calorie of energy, to say nothing of developments in regenerative agriculture, permaculture, aquaculture, and prairie perennials. Now, our current food system, however, and current food systems are largely kept in place through all kinds of structures of power, ranging from trade agreements to the Farm Bill, which support giant corporations and limit consumer access. And the consumption of food is driven by all kinds of cultural formations, which are perhaps nowhere more clear than an expanding consumption of meat. Whereas a hot dog or hamburger might be delicious, these forms of food are also importantly associated with visions of masculinity, success, family, community, and celebration. The hot dog is tied up with the ballpark, the burger with the summer cookout. There is nothing natural or primal about the amount of meat the average American eats. But the consequences are catastrophic, as livestock production amounts to 15% of total carbon emissions. Other ways of measuring it suggest that it contributes significantly more than this. Now, the food movement and the food justice initiatives, however, show the way that grassroots power can be built. Here, change is cultivated through the transformation of our foodways, that is, our cultural traditions around food, as the fast food eaten in front of a screen is replaced by a dinner church gathering around a local and seasonal meal. Here, the processed and plastic-wrapped commodities of the supermarket are replaced by the bulk bins of the co-op or the basket of produce from a farm share and community-supported agriculture. The purpose of these changes is not to imagine that individual action will move the needle on the numbers of global carbon emissions, but the hope is that the focus on relationships, practices, and local infrastructure can help build sustainable communities and cultivate the collection action needed for the long work of pushing for structural change over decades. Now, the approach of environmental justice would also demand that we not just focus on the problem of climate change. Rather, it would demand that we draw out other flowcharts. Here, we would need to consider the problems of injustice and oppression, which are rooted in the component parts of racism, poverty, sexism, and so on. But as we traced these problems to their sources, we would see that they are rooted in the same structures of power and ways of life. Multinational corporations do not just desecrate the earth and burn fossil fuels, but they exploit workers and extend poverty. Zoning boards and corporate boards do not just make decisions that externalize costs onto the environment, but they make decisions to locate pollution and waste in communities of color, and which cause intergenerational destruction. In addition to seeing the ways that current structures of power desecrate the earth and oppress the marginalized, we could draw these flowcharts to show how the problems that plague the middle managers of these imperial globalized systems are rooted in the same sources. Right? So the depression, isolation, anxiety, debt, hopelessness, and emptiness that plagues middle-class America is also rooted in the neoliberal workplace and the hyperconsumption of the affluent suburbs. So from the perspective of environmental justice, while these problems are distinct, they are not separate. Therefore, what is demanded is not the formation of a special interest group that takes on a narrow problem, but what is demanded is broad-based organizing that seeks structural change and the cultivation of alternative economies, communities, and ways of life that will make this work possible and that will show its worth and viability. Furthermore, work in one area that addresses the roots and the sources of the problem are allied with other areas. Disentangling whiteness and its visions of property, commodification, displacement, subjugation, and identity is at the heart of challenging and transforming a way of life that is at the root of oppression and climate change. So transformation on this model does not come from a version of power that is exercised from the top down, but rather it tries to harness people power which emerges from below. Yet because our world and ways of life have been so profoundly shaped by the dominant structures of power, it seems naive to hope that all we need to do is just mobilize the masses of people. People can't be mobilized before they are first organized, one of the premises of community organizing. But also, people can't be organized if there aren't communities, right? And our communities need to be not just organized, but reorganized and transformed because our lives and the infrastructure that surrounds us is set to the default of consumerism, neoliberalism, and cowboy capitalism. Now, religious communities are equipped to build these interventions and to transform the area as labeled in the flowchart ways of life. Christian traditions and communities can engage in the task of resisting dominant moral traditions and shaping communities with another vision, and in shaping the social infrastructure that breathes life-giving spirit into these visions. Christian communities can speak in a moral language that lays bare the violence from what our mainstream culture takes as normal and natural. So, now from the perspective of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the American gospel of work no longer operates at the transparent level of norms and common sense, but is shown to be an insidious and violent force that celebrates constant work, consumption, competition, growth, wealth, and individualism. This American gospel of work can be shown as a culture-wide form of Stockholm Syndrome that convinces people to identify with their captors as superior semi-divine job creators. Furthermore, Christian communities have resources and practices through preaching, teaching, study, spiritual exercise, and communal dynamics to live into an alternative moral life, into our counter-hegemonic imagination. Churches are also some of the last holdouts of communities that are not completely shaped by the metrics and practices of the neoliberal business world, though many pastors and lay people have tried to colonize this space as well. So as such, churches and especially alternative Christian communities and new ways of being church are places where we can begin to experiment with and collaborate on different kinds of economies and ways of life. This means that the efforts of caring for creation cannot be sent to a committee that tries to fill the same old structures with new content, powering our buildings with solar power or getting us to stop using paper plates at the potluck. Nor can the efforts of justice merely be to mobilize people to show up at the Capitol and to write a letter to the representative. The church needs to be transformed so that it can be a space in which ways of life are also changed. This might mean moving the church out of a building into people's homes or onto a farm. It might mean repurposing the church building as a hub for communal life. It will mean not just raising people's consciousness about the ecological crisis as a technical and technological problem that demands consumer change, but as a systemic problem that demands a change in our work lives, our home lives, our social lives, and our political lives. It will mean drawing on the rich resources of tradition that will allow us to see the cruel ways of the world which have crept into our hearts, and the practices and processes that will allow us to communally be redeemed and transformed. This means that not only can the care of creation not be sent to committee, or not just a committee, but the church cannot be compartmentalized to one building or to Sunday. We must begin to embrace the call of discipleship and Christ's vision for an entirely different way of life. This means shifting our focus from the choices made by individuals to focusing on relationships, practices, and local places and economies. In the Gospels, this is often where Christ's ministry takes place, at the level of organizing meals, healing people to be restored into their community, organizing alternative food economies, engaging in a radical and imaginative pedagogy, and so on. Christ provided less the kind of kingdom where the king takes a city by violence and continues to rule by force from above, as a kingdom that arises from the grassroots power of communities which are organized around the central practices of joy, love, care, and peace.